Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, I want to make something very clear. Bach didn't compose the Goldberg Variations for the piano. He composed them for the harpsichord. Specifically, he composed them for the double manual harpsichord, a special instrument with two separate keyboards that allow the performer to play with all sorts of different effects.
As it says on the cover, it says double manual harpsichord, which was for that time kind of a swish, sort of swanky, definitely like a Cadillac of an instrument.
That's the harpsichordist Mahan Esfahani. Bach apparently was very fond of the harpsichord. Some of Bach's most famous works, from the keyboard partitas to the Italian concerto to the well-tempered clavier, were written for harpsichord. Bach was the first major composer to treat the harpsichord as an equal in chamber music. Before Bach, the harpsichord had always played an accompanying role to other instruments. Harpsichordists wouldn't even have their parts written out for them, just the bass line and the sequence of chords, a notation known as figured bass. But with Bach, harpsichordists got their own fully conceived music. They even got their own concertos. To be honest, Bach went wild with harpsichords sometimes, like when he composed a concerto for 3 harpsichords, each with its own virtuosic music to play. This is an excerpt from that concerto. One of my favorite Bach letters is one he wrote to Johann Georg Martius, a harpsichord maker from whom Bach had ordered a new harpsichord. Apparently, the harpsichord was long past due. Bach yelled through his pen, "Mr. Martius, my patience is now at its end. How long do you think I must wait for the harpsichord? You must bring it in good order and within 5 days, else we shall never be friends." So, Bach cared about his harpsichords and conceived the Goldberg Variations for the harpsichord. Admittedly, he couldn't have written the piece for the piano, since the piano didn't exist yet when he was writing the Variations. It wasn't until years later that Bach tried out a forte piano, the modern piano's predecessor, in the court of Frederick the Great. But there are also some major advantages to playing the piece on a harpsichord, especially one with 2 keyboards. To appreciate the advantages, though, you need to know a bit about the anatomy of a harpsichord. Kristian Nyquist, a harpsichordist and professor in Karlsruhe, Germany, is here to help us. I met Nyquist at his studio at the Music University in Karlsruhe. I'm not exaggerating when I say that he works in a castle. Nyquist grew up hearing the Goldberg Variations, but the first time he played any portion of the piece was in a sight reading exam for his bachelor's degree.
My teacher, who I think esteemed me quite highly, she gave me the aria and the first 2 variations. She really made it hard for me, but I somehow got along. But I think even her colleagues said that was a little bit too difficult, they thought.
Nyquist next learned part of the piece for a competition in Prague in 1994, but he really went all in with the Goldbergs at the turn of the millennium. The year 2000 was the 250th anniversary of Bach's death, and proved an opportune time to perform the Goldbergs.
Of course, Bach can be celebrated every year, every day, but it just helped for organizers to make more out of it and to attract maybe more audience or whatever.
Nyquist ultimately performed the piece 11 times in 2000.
Every performance was different, of course. The very first performances, I was extremely nervous and full of respect for playing the piece and not knowing how I was going to get through, which probably is true for anyone who starts performing them.
Not every concert was nerve-wracking or perfectionistic. In one performance set at a municipal library, Nyquist alternated between playing the Goldbergs and reading from Kreisleriana, a book by a 19th century German author in which the protagonist gets drunk while playing the Goldbergs. So you were actually talking about it as you played through it?
Yeah.
And serving wine as well.
Well, maybe I should have.
Okay, so now I want to get to talking about the harpsichord itself.
First of all, you have a keyboard, or like in this case, even two keyboards, like on an organ, lower and an upper manual. The big difference is that the strings are being plucked by a special mechanism, which is actually rather simple or almost primitive.
Maybe harpsichordists will balk at this analogy, but I imagine the harpsichord as a kind of mechanical harp. Instead of plucking with your fingers, you're pressing keys that engage quills to pluck the strings for you. With two manuals, there are two separate sets of strings, each engaged by one of the manuals. The result is that the two manuals, upper and lower, sound very slightly different.
So if I play one note on the lower, on the principal manual, it will sound like this. And the same note on the upper manual will sound differently. Yeah. Of course, this will be different with every instrument.
Pianists like me always think that the harpsichord is limited. Unlike the piano, the harpsichord doesn't respond to changes in the pressure of your touch. In other words, whether you press down lightly on a note or you bang on the note, the same sound comes out. That's just the way the harpsichord is constructed. But what I learned in talking to Nyquist is that the harpsichord is actually very flexible and gives the performer many tools to play with the sound. As one example, the lower manual is generally louder than the upper manual. The subtle differences in the sound of the two manuals give the harpsichordist a choice when approaching Bach's music.
If he writes a variation supposed to be played on one manual, actually already gives you as a player the possibility to either play it downstairs, as we say, or upstairs, which you could use, for example, as a change if you repeat. Yeah, and you will have a different color. A pianist might choose a different dynamic level for a repeat. On the harpsichord, that would be the equivalent that you change manuals.
To show me what he was talking about, Nyquist demonstrated with Variation 1, playing first on the lower manual, then on the upper manual. This is on the lower manual.
You have this. Really can attack the instrument. On the upper manual.
Notice how the first sound is more aggressive and the second more delicate. The harpsichordist can also increase the sound yet more by coupling the two manuals, which engages all of their strings at the same time. Interestingly, the coupling only goes in one direction, so one manual sounds a lot louder, while the other sounds the same volume as before. This creates an even greater contrast that can be useful when the harpsichordist wants to bring out the melody. Like organs, harpsichords have what are called stops. Pulling these stops changes the plucking mechanism in some way. For example, pulling a stop can change which set of strings are plucked, and it's common to have one set of strings that is tuned an octave above the normal range. So pulling a stop can raise the notes that sound when playing one of the keyboards. Here's an example from an awesome YouTuber harpsichordist called SF Christo.
So these are strings that are much shorter and much thinner. So here's this pitch of this much higher set.
With a two-manual harpsichord, the player could have one keyboard at normal pitch and another keyboard an octave above, which creates a huge contrast. There's also the lute stop.
If you want to be very playful, you could do something which not every instrument has, but most of the instruments did. That's the so-called lute stop, which you usually have on the upper manual. This is the normal sound, and the lute stop will take away overtones. So that could be kind of cute in a certain way to have.
The lute stop works by pulling little pieces of leather, or felt in modern instruments, across the strings to dampen their vibration. The effect is to remove overtones that sound around the main pitch. It's like cleaning up the note, and it makes the instrument sound more like a guitar or a lute. It seems that Bach liked this lute stop sound. Around 1740, when he was writing the Goldberg Variations, Bach designed a so-called lute harpsichord that included such a lute stop. One observer recalled that when the stop was drawn, quote, "it was almost possible to deceive even professional lute players." There are even more effects that a harpsichordist can play with, but I want to just show you a sample of one of the variations played by Mahan Esfahani, the harpsichordist who you heard earlier. I want to show you this example because it plays with the effects we've just been talking about. This is from the beginning of Variation 19.
On the first repeat, I play the upper manual with there's a little batten under the strings that you can push, and it puts these pieces of buffalo leather to push against the strings. And so they dampen most of the partials of the strings. And so it sounds like a guitar.
Esfahani is using the lute stop for the first part of the variation.
And then on the repeat, I go to the lower manual where I've taken off the 8-foot register and I've put on the 4-foot register, which is an octave above, which has a sort of piccolo-like quality, and it's an octave above.
As you can hear, there's a kind of toy music box quality to the music now, because Esfahani is using the stop that raises the notes by an octave. The point of this example is just to show how flexible the harpsichord can be. In the Goldberg Variations, Bach indicated some variations as meant for only one manual, and some variations for two. He also indicated that some variations, like Variation 7, could be played on one manual or two manuals. Having two manuals, just from a technical point of view, is a huge advantage. There are many variations in which, playing on the piano, your fingers get completely tangled. With two manuals, that's not a problem.
The fact that these lines can completely intertwine independently is a great advantage that the harpsichord has. I mean, on the piano, you're ultimately slightly compromising. I mean, by the way, compromise doesn't mean less good, because of course there's some performances that do that wonderfully. But that advantage of the harpsichord, well, obviously a piece with crossed lines on different manuals is quite a unique thing that you don't get on anything else.
Recall Variation 5, which we heard Simona Dinnerstein play on the piano a couple of episodes ago. Just imagine how much easier that would be if you didn't have to worry about your hands getting tangled. While Bach indicated whether a variation should be played on one manual or two, what he didn't indicate was what effects to apply. And that's where harpsichordists have room to experiment.
Bach doesn't indicate any of that. I also want to add to that, not only do we not have any idea what he would have done, it's also irrelevant. That's really important. I mean, we have lots of recordings of composers playing their works, and that's secondary to interpretation. Like, we don't resign ourselves as interpreters just because we have a composer's recording.
People often think about the harpsichord as antiquated or old school. But what I gleaned in talking to both Nyquist and Esfahani is that the music remains very much alive and fresh for them. Both musicians are avid experimenters. Nyquist, for his part, recently released an album of modern music, and before that collaborated with a guitarist on an album of Mexican sonatas. Esfahani has appeared in all the major venues you've heard of for classical music, as well as playing for an NPR Tiny Desk concert.
You know what? I think every performer has a different role. Lately, I've been reflecting that, in a sense, there's room for every kind of performer. You know, like, everybody has something to bring to the table. I know my personal role is to maybe cause you to stop and think, let me listen to that again.
There's a certain paradox to hearing a recording of the Goldbergs on the harpsichord. On the one hand, because the harpsichord is the instrument for which the piece was first written, hearing it on harpsichord can feel like peering back in history, like looking at old photos. You can imagine, this is what it sounded like to Count Kaiserling as Goldberg played for him in his bedchambers. On the other hand, because harpsichords are rare these days, hearing a harpsichord recording can actually be refreshing, drawing your attention to new aspects of the music that you don't notice on the piano. I want to leave you with a few variations on harpsichord. We're going to hear from Kristian Nyquist, who recorded the Goldbergs after hours in a monastery-turned-museum in the French city of Colmar.
That was a very special experience, of course, to record in the museum. I had to record after closing hour, which was, well, hard to put it in words. It was just very special. And I don't know if it had an effect on the recording or not. However, I think there are 2-3 moments where you hear some birds in the background, which I actually thought nice.
To be honest, I can't hear the birds, at least not in the variations I'm going to show you. We're going to go back to variations 7, 8, and 9, which you heard pianist Dan Tepfer play in the last episode. To give you something to compare, here's how the beginning of variation 7 sounds on the piano. This is Tepfer. Here's Nyquist variations 7, 8, and 9 on harpsichord. Thanks for listening. In this episode, you heard playing by harpsichordists Kristian Nyquist and Mahan Esfahani, as well as brief excerpts from pianists Simona Dinnerstein and Dan Tepfer. You also heard an excerpt from the Netherlands Bach Society's performance of Bach's Concerto for 3 harpsichords, with Mortensen, Henstra, and Van Delft on harpsichords. Before signing off, I want to thank the many listeners who have written in to share reactions to the podcast, as well as stories about their own responses to Bach's music. I love hearing from you, so please don't hesitate to write to me. My email is lowry@30bach.com. That's spelled Lowry at 30bach.com. Finally, in the next episode, we'll broach a topic that may have been in the back of many people's minds when they first started listening to this podcast: the legacy of Glenn Gould, whose recordings of the Goldbergs became famous in a way that few classical recordings do. We'll speak with pianist Ben Lottie, who relied on Gould's recordings in a period of musical crisis. See you next week.